welcome everybody to this episode of the NextGen webinar and also the NextGen podcast. Today we have Sam Halverson with us, and Sam is an elder in the North Georgia Conference and is the, let him give us a specific title, but I know that he is somewhat of a director of young people's ministries and other things from the North Georgia Conference. And so Sam, welcome today. And in a little bit, I'm going to have Sam give a little bit more about himself to us, about who he is, and before we get into his book. But Sam wrote a really great book that I had the pleasure to read probably a couple of years ago, I think is when it came out, right? Or a year ago?
Yeah, a couple of years ago.
And called One Body, and integrating teenagers into the whole life of the church. And so we all talk about how we can provide spaces for youth to serve and to be, but it's even beyond that. And so I've asked Sam to come and share his insight into this topic. He is a father of a couple of young people, and so his mom is pretty well known in children's ministry circles, Nelia Halverson. And I got the opportunity to meet her at the Christian Educators Fellowship Conference a couple years ago. So it was sort of like meeting one of the stars of the children's ministry world, according to everybody that I met there. So Sam, welcome, and the screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. So yeah, definitely, you were probably right in asking me to name my title, because they've changed it, and it's long, and nothing in the title says anything about youth and young adults.
All right.
I'm Associate Director of Congregational Excellence. They just opened up that new area, and that does mean, though, that my focus here in the conference is youth and young adult ministries. So I appreciate you inviting me to be a part of this.
Yeah.
Before I open up any of the slides, I wanted to kind of open up just by pointing out that, or asking everyone to reflect on, if I were to ask you to share with me, tell me a little bit about how your congregation, members of your congregation, do youth ministry in your church. Think for a second about how you would respond to that. I thought about just having everybody do that, but in order to save some time here, maybe we'll just have you think about it. What would you tell me if I were to ask you to describe the way your congregation supports and practices youth ministry? I would imagine a lot of you would start telling me about some of your programs. Am I right? Raise your hand if that's the case, if you're thinking through your programs. I mean, I would do the same thing. I've been doing youth ministry for 35 plus years, and as I think of that question, I go through all of the different programs and ways, retreats and activities that we used to do. I'm not in the local church anymore, but that's where my head goes. And rather than only thinking of that, I'd like for us to think about a response that your congregation already is giving in the area of youth ministry, and that is this vow. Is it something that you recognize? With God's help, we will so order our lives after the example of Christ, that this child, surrounded by steadfast love, may be established in the faith and confirmed and strengthened in the way that leads to life. Most congregations, if you do infant baptism or baptism of really young people, which the United Methodist Church does, you're going to recognize this or some vow very similar. And it's a baptismal vow, but it's not the vow of the person being baptized. This is the vow of the congregation. This is what the congregation promises to do. And the vow doesn't say, with God's help, we will so hire a individual to come in and do youth ministry for this person. It doesn't say we're going to find enough volunteers to take care of this person until they're old enough to be in worship or to be with the congregation in ministry. It says that we're going to surround them in these things. And the reason why this comes up for me is, now how am I? Oh, it's not going forward or backward. The reason why I started thinking about this is I grew up in North and South Dakota. And I can remember when we would travel to Minnesota, where my cousins and uncle and aunt lived, we would pass by farmland, a lot of farmland, and at the farms we would see these silos. And when the more silos in the farm, the more we recognized or believed that the farm was a success. You'd have the silos that would hold the grain, and every silo had its particular style of grain or kind of grain, or the time the grain was harvested, and it allowed the farmers to keep those things separate and to know what was where. When I moved to Atlanta, into the big city, I distinctly remember us driving through the city, and my mom, who was very United Methodist oriented, when we would drive through, she would point to a church and say, "Oh, look, there's such and such United Methodist church," or "There's another United Methodist church." And if you could see the campus and you could see a youth building, for some reason we got the idea that they must have a successful youth ministry. They have this place, this separate place that the youth would be able to spend their time in their ministry. But that kind of a judgment or a measuring tool of a successful youth ministry, I've discovered, isn't as effective as I thought it was at the time. Youth and their families often attend a certain church because of the youth ministry programs. But what happens when the teenager outgrows youth group? What do they end up doing? How do they end up recognizing their church? Many active youth in churches have seldom or never been to the main worship service or interacted with the rest of the congregation outside the youth program. The church where I attend is on a campus or a property of about 67 acres. And if you drive by on Birmingham Highway and you look to where the sign is, you don't see the church building. You see the youth building because the youth are meeting in the old chapel right there next to the highway. But the main church building is further down this long driveway and back in the woods, not visible from most directions from the main road. On Sunday morning, the youth meet at the same time that the congregation meets for worship. And some of you who are experienced in a setting like that or have read about it will know right away that that's not the best setting, because it means that the parents drop the youth off at the front of the property on their way to worship, and then when they're done worshiping, they drive back out and they pick the youth up and they drive away. And what has happened is that a good majority of those youth don't regularly come to worship, and quite a few of them have never even stepped foot in that church building. They've just come to the youth building on Sunday morning while their parents come to the rest of it. This is what we would call siloed ministry. Youth ministry has become very siloed in a lot of our churches, meaning that we have a separate area, a separate ministry where the youth can be very active and very appreciated by those involved in the ministry, but the rest of the church knows nothing about them. And worse than that, the youth know nothing about the rest of the church. They don't recognize their congregation. Division into silos isn't biblical, and the kingdom of God is diverse, so why would our ministries be exclusive and divided? And that's what I talk about in this book, One Body. When a person's participating in a church only through siloed or separate ministries, he or she will almost certainly stop attending after that ministry is over, or after he or she gets too old for the ministry. As I have grown up through youth ministry, I've watched a lot of my past youth grow up, and I've been in connection with them through Facebook and other social media, and some of them are in their 30s or 40s. And as I connect with them, I'll ask them, so tell me what you're doing now, where are you going to church in that location where you're living? And it's interesting how many of them, especially interesting how the ones who were very active in the youth ministry when they were teenagers, came to everything. They participated whenever the doors were open. It's interesting how many of them are no longer active in a church. And the reason they say is because we have never been able to find a church that was like youth ministry at such and such church when I was growing up. I'm curious if any of you have, if this dynamic, this thought process, or this struggle is new or unusual for you.
We did have a question from one that just trying to understand that concept, because it might not be something that they do in their church.
Mm-hmm.
But I have seen congregations in our conference that have either youth worship during adult worship, or they have youth Sunday school during youth worship. But I also sort of, as you were thinking, and I made the comment that we tend to do it even more to children across all sizes of churches.
Yeah.
While youth might be in worship more often, children are the group that we are creating this movement of out of worship, right? By creating their own children's church and things like that too. So I just wonder if we're setting ourselves up by thinking that that's the right.
I think so.
You know?
Yeah, I think so, definitely. I mean, I hate to accuse, but I really do believe that it has started with the children ministry. Mm-hmm. And because it's so prevalent in children's ministry, by the time they're teenagers, they aren't feeling comfortable or welcome or a feeling of understanding of what worship is with the whole congregation when they come in as teenagers.
Yeah.
There's a lot of reasons why some of our teenagers don't want to be in I'm going to call it the corporate worship, the corporate, the worship of the whole congregation. And so I wouldn't point to just one reason, but I think that has helped to support that, that desire.
And I agree with you. And I think that part of that too is that Nick said that we're really good at just making assumptions that people know what to do and how to do it and how to behave. And so we have these norms that we expect people to adhere to, and whether that's as Nick said, proper worship behavior, but we've really not done any kind of preparation for them to understand. I mean, my children and I and my wife, what was it? It was Christmas Eve. We served communion. We were part of the team that served communion, and my daughter and I were together, and my son and wife were together at two separate stations. And of course, we do it as the proper way by intinction. But
the way Jesus and his disciples did it, right?
Exactly. Yes, you dip your fingers in it, but there was Collins was confused because this one man came up, and he had the cup, and instead of him taking the bread and dip it in the juice, when he took the bread from Shelley, he ate the bread, and then he reached to grab the cup from Collins. And Collins is a wrestler, so he was like, well, I didn't give you that cup. So, but the guy didn't know, right? He didn't understand what fiction was. And so it's not, so it's like, are we setting people up for expectations that they're not sure about,
Yeah. And I think it goes more than just teaching. Like children's church often will do a good job of teaching children what the parts of worship are. We at our church, we do take no matter how much I complain about it, we do take the children out of worship. They're not participating in any part of congregational worship, and they go down to the children's area, except for on communion Sundays. We do. It's kind of weird because at the end of the service, or at the end of the sermon, we start the communion ritual, and then we invite the children up first. So the children come to the door of the sanctuary from the children's area, and they walk up, everybody all at once down the center aisle, and they have communion, and then they walk back out again, and then the families get up and have communion. And I'm like, seems so strange. We're not doing it as families, you could, and then that's the last thing we do in worship. So at the end of that worship service, the parents then go down to the children's area and pick up their kids. It would seem to be a lot easier if they would just tell the children, find your parents, sit with them, and then they'll all go up and have communion together. But what I was going to say is, what a young person can learn in participating in worship is more than just what we can teach them about the different parts of worship, like what is the doxology and what is the pastoral prayer and the scripture lesson. Yeah, those are important. But for a child to look over and see Mr. Jones praying or singing or responding to scripture in a certain way, or listening intently to the faith or to this message, or even laughing out loud to a joke that might be told, when we participate with a congregation, it's something much more personal and something much more intentional than just telling them, you know, what this part of the worship service is, or teaching them a song. We had a family in our congregation a couple years ago who went through an unexpected, a very terrible tragedy. Their daughter, who was in college, was killed in a car accident. And I remember very clearly the Sunday after the funeral. It was Communion Sunday, and Kathy, my wife, and I were helping to serve communion at the front. We went up to our station, and I looked out over the congregation, and I saw right in the front row where they usually sit, this family, the parents and the brother of this girl who had died. And I thought, oh wow, this is going to be a really tough communion time right now, because the congregation's going to see this, the family, and sure enough, as the family came up and was served, as people started spending time there at the altar rail, it was very emotional, but it was also very, very caring. If I were to point to the top few instances that I have witnessed a congregation truly reaching out and being pastoral and loving and caring, that would be one of the top three situations, one of the top three stories. And unfortunately, the children didn't see any of that. And for them to be a part of a non-planned action of the Holy Spirit, reaching out and caring for other members of the congregation, for them to have been able to witness that and see that would have spoken more than any message that we could have preached from the pulpit or could have taught in the children's church. Every now and then, you know, when the Holy Spirit shows up in worship in ways unplanned, I want my kids to see that. I want them to be a part of that. And that goes for the teenagers as well. So there's a statistic that it's a study from Sticky Faith, the people at Fuller Seminary, who I don't know, Brad, you might know better when this was done. I keep saying about 10 years ago, but I don't know exactly when they did this study.
Yeah, I think it was about 10 to 12 years ago. There was a couple of different studies that were sort of back-to-back extended.
Yeah. So what they did was they wanted to find out what the most effective youth ministry tool was that encouraged and enabled youth after they graduated, young adults, to continue to stay active in church, or perhaps the church they grew up in, or some congregation. But what was it that an active youth, when they were a teenager, what was it that they were participating in that most likely would keep them involved when they are no longer teenagers? And so they surveyed not quite 1,000 young adults who had been active in their churches when they were growing up, to find out just how they were involved in those churches and whether or not they were still involved in worship now as adults, or still involved in church now as adults. What they discovered was those young adults who had been involved in other areas of the congregation, namely worship or singing in the choir, or serving in the nursery, or helping with Vacation Bible School, participating in fellowship dinners, some other ministry other than youth ministry, that those people were much more likely to still be involved in church as adults than the people who were only involved in the youth programs. Does that make sense? In looking back over the people I'm familiar with, the people that I'm still in touch with from my earlier youth ministry years, I would say that's the case. The people who were very active in just the youth ministry, the majority of them are no longer involved in church. However, the ones that I kept beating my head against the wall trying to get them to not go to serve in the nursery, but to come to youth group instead, or the ones who would only come to worship on Sunday morning, and I'd keep telling them, I would really love to see you start coming to youth group. They're the ones that are still active in their churches. And
what do you think caused that, or what do you, as you saw those people?
Yeah, I think what that was exactly what Sticky Faith tries to teach, and what I attack in this book, and that is that they didn't have a relationship with their whole congregation. They had some great relationship with the other teenagers. They were even leaders of the youth group. But if I were to have them go to worship on a Sunday morning, they wouldn't have known anyone there, and they wouldn't have, many of them, and they wouldn't have had anyone there know them and call them by name. They didn't feel a part of that congregation. And I wonder how many times our graduated seniors or college students, when they come back, if they've never been involved in church during high school, if they don't know their congregation, how welcome do they feel to come back into the sanctuary or to come to another ministry other than the youth ministry and come and talk to people and get to know people and let them know what's going on. So I had told you that Sticky Faith was going to also they wanted to find out what was the single most influential activity or ministry that would keep people involved even after they left high school. And they discovered that what that is congregational worship. If they were involved in worship with their church congregation, they were much more likely to stay active in church than if they were only coming to the youth ministry things. Now, I'm not suggesting that we get rid of our youth ministry programs. I think that we need to keep those. I think our youth need to have sustainable ministries that carry on. But another part of sustainable youth ministry is something that will encourage and enable, give older youth the tools to stay active in a local church, or to become active in a church when they're no longer recognizing it as a youth ministry. For me, as a youth minister, my goal is that the youth that I minister to will continue to remain strong in their witness, in their worship, in their being participants of the church body long after they get out of my youth ministry. What does that feel like to you? Is it something that you've recognized as well, or is it surprising? Anybody have any comments? You can unmute. Nick, as a pastor and you were a youth minister, and right, and growing
assistant, sort of.
Assistant,
yeah. Yeah. So I did, for my own story, I was a worship leader in my home church, and then I was hired by Tuxton in Athens to lead the youth worship, but also to help with main congregational worship. So that, I knew my connection outside of my calling would keep me in church. But then I think about my young adults that are involved in church after having left youth and either went to college and came back, or are still involved during college. And that theory is very much so true, that if they're involved in some other aspect. So my AV guys are young adults. Well, they're in church because that's their role and that's how others know them. And the ones who have been helping with nursery, that's also accurate. They've maintained a connection. So the kids that I see in youth group, and they may come to worship, but if they do come to worship, they're not involved. it's pretty much a guarantee that when they go to college, I'll reach out to them, but it's up to the family and the church itself to encourage them to want to come back.
Yeah. Yeah. So the key to this then is these relationships, and the book One Body goes through some various ways. Part of the books looks at how we, specifically the youth ministry, build up the walls of this silo and make them stronger. And sometimes, most of the times, I would say, through things that we really do want to happen. For example, a great youth space, a great youth ministry space. I don't know too many youth ministers who would push that away and say, no, I really don't want a place for my youth to meet. One of the churches that I served had no youth space. And I remember the frustration of having a youth Bible study in the middle of the week in one of the rooms that was made for the nursery. And I had kids sitting at little dinky tables, and the middle schoolers always wanting to play with the plastic kitchens. I mean, it wasn't the most effective place to teach a Bible study, but it was all we had at the time.
Now, did some of those middle schoolers turn into chefs and have their own restaurant?
I should check and see. You're right.
Yeah. Brooke, did you want to say something earlier? Brooke, did you want to make a comment?
I was trying to figure out how to unmute. Well, I was a little bit surprised because I know that some of the newer models of churches have separate worship for youth, separate worship for kids. I did not know that was happening in the United Methodist Church. So in our church, we have a children's church time, but our children come into worship for about half of the worship, half of the service, and then halfway through they exit. We do not have separate worship for youth. So that was a little bit surprising to me because everything you're saying makes perfect sense. The fact that they are silo ministries, and it makes perfect sense that they're going to connect better if they've been in the congregation and met their church family and they know each other. So yes, that was kind of what struck me.
Yeah. There aren't a lot that do that. As a conference person here in North Georgia, I do often hear of even senior pastors that are pushing to make that move. And the reason is because they want more youth on Sunday morning. And they're either afraid of no longer doing the youth worship because they could end up losing some youth on Sunday morning as a result of that, or they recognize the statistic that when a church does a youth worship, they're going to get more youth usually coming on Sunday morning because they're more willing to come to worship. It's easier for a parent to talk a youth into joining them on Sunday morning if the youth know that they're going to a separate youth worship service rather than the main congregational worship. So a lot of what we're struggling with here is a short-term answer of getting a lot more youth to show up on Sundays, or a long-term one that is much more sustainable and much deeper. And I keep thinking of Jesus's parable of the seeds, the sower and the seeds, and specifically the seeds that fell on thin soil. And if what we're doing is just trying to give them something that they can have a good feeling there in worship at that time, then that's like the thin soil with the rocky soil where the roots don't really get very deep, but all of a sudden the plant starts to grow, and you've got the flowers, or you've got the stalk of the plant growing very quickly. But when something tough comes, there's nothing rooted there, and they're destroyed. And then I look at an actual congregational worship and the time that it takes to build those relationships and have them sinking into something fertile and deep and something that sustains them. And then when those tough times come, they've got the roots of the congregation. They've got the roots of their church family to help them. So I wanted to go through a list here of some of the different keys to helping youth ministry that would be much more sustainable and not so rooted in the silo. And then hopefully I can also get to have time to get to, or at least answer your questions about ways to get out of those. Some other ideas. One is worship. We've already talked a little bit about that. The single most common activity that young adults had experienced that seemed to help their faith roots grow. And then when we take youth away from a corporate or combined worship experience, we're taking away the most effective thing that ties our young to the body of Christ. The other part of that, I don't want us to see this bringing youth into worship as something that's only one way. It's not just the youth that benefit from that. You can probably point to times when you have seen a child or a young person in worship in the congregation, and the way they respond or the way that they are worshiping just also encourages you and feeds your faith in worship. When we take that away from our congregations and the adults don't see that, we are actually cutting off a part of the kingdom of God. Jesus said, unless you become like children, you're not going to experience the kingdom. And I think that experience of the kingdom has got to happen in worship as well. And if we don't have the young people in worship, then we're cutting our own selves off of experiencing that part of the kingdom. There are other ways to keep this bond strong to the congregation, but you'll have to work 2 or 3 times harder and do it much more intentionally. What I mean by that is the situation that I told you about in my church, where we do have youth worship at the same time that we have congregational worship. It means, because now's not the time, we have a new youth minister at the church. He's been there just a little over a year. It's not quite the good timing yet to just go in and cut that out. But it does mean that we've got to work twice as hard in other areas, bringing in members of the congregation, not the volunteers with the youth ministry, but others in the congregation, bringing them in and having them participate in worship in different ways, or creating a goal of having at least one youth involved in the congregational worship in some way or another every single Sunday. You had mentioned your youth that grew up in the tech booth. So you can have youth helping with the sound booth or the tech booth. You could have youth singing in the choir. You could have them reading the scripture, helping to serve communion. All of these different areas with the main congregational worship, so that youth presence is also there. Another one is faith connections with significant adults. Connecting relationally with significant adults who are strong in their faith. I always tell youth ministers, or I tell congregations when they're trying to design their youth ministry, that the job of a youth minister is to teach the congregation how to do youth ministry. The job of the youth minister is not to develop the relationships with the teenagers, as so many people might think. I've heard many pastors say that we just need to hire somebody who can build relationships with all of our teenagers. And that's putting a terrible, terrible stress and emphasis on that one person who, when they're no longer at the church, or if the youth are no longer in the youth ministry, that relationship is lost. So my job as a youth minister in a congregation is to get to know the congregation outside of the youth ministry. That's beyond the parents, beyond the volunteers. Get to know the congregation so that I can develop relationships between the congregation members and the teenagers. That means youth ministers need to start looking for opportunities to meet the congregation. Stand out in the narthex, start shaking hands and getting to know the stories of your church members. Go to the UMW luncheons and sit at the tables and listen to them and talk to them and engage with them. Suggest to your pastor that every now and then you fill in some hospital visits. And they don't have to be visits of only your parents of teenagers or the teenagers themselves. These are church members who need to know that the youth ministry is a vital part of their congregation. This will help you to get to know their story and hearing how they live out their faith. And the more that the youth see those faith connections do that, the more they'll be connected to the congregation. One other thing that Sticky Faith discovered was that the most influential person or persons in the faith development of a teenager is the parent. And that can either be a positive effect or a negative effect. And if that's the case, if our parents are the ones who have the strongest effect on a teenager's faith journey, then what does that tell us about youth ministry and who it should be reaching out to? Yes, it needs to reach out to youth, but we also need to find ways to support and enable and give training and tools to our parents so that they know how to help their own kids in faith, or they feel at least like they're capable of that. No faith practice is still a very strong influence. In other words, if they don't have a faith practice, if they don't carry that on, that communicates to our teenagers, to their children, that this isn't something very important. So we can support parents in this by connecting them with peers and resources. If the more you get to know your congregation and their stories, the more you would be able to even connect some of your parents of teenagers with other adults in the congregation that might be able to give them support. Perhaps past parents, their kids have already graduated and left, but they might have some great insight on, or at least ways to support some of your parents. Another one is familiarity with the congregation. I mentioned that should be two-way, not just the youth are helped by that, but the congregation is helped by that. A time and a place to lead and to fail. I think it's really important that our teenagers learn that failure is okay in their youth ministry and in their church, to be able to speak up and maybe mess up, and this is a safe place for that. Give them an experience of leading worship, of participating in planning meetings and events, and serving and participating in committee meetings. Do any of you have teenagers serving on any of your church committees or planning committees other than a youth ministry planning team? Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry, we do. In fact, for our main huge conference that we're doing this summer, we've invited 2 youth and 3 young adults to be a part of our design team. And the design team is the team that puts together how the actual service is going to be put together, and to get their input. And so we're wanting to be intentional in that way, and trying to also not be going to the extreme of, we just need to plug in youth and children into a specific area just to say that we're integrated, but yet we're just plugging them in, because that's failing miserably.
Right. So integrating youth into the life of the church is more than just having them sit in the chairs. It's actually bringing them into the planning, like you're talking about.
Yeah.
I would imagine everybody out there probably has youth that you rely on for help in Vacation Bible School. Am I right? If you do a Vacation Bible School, that you probably have teenagers helping with that. I'll bet you've got some teenagers who have been doing that for 3 or 4 years in a row. And more than likely, they have been doing it more than some of your adults that have been doing it, especially if you were to count the years that they were participating as a child in Vacation Bible School. So why not put 1 or 2 of those very informed youth on your next Vacation Bible School planning team? They don't have to plan the whole thing. They can be given one small part of it. They really don't have to be relied on for a lot of the ideas or creativity. My point in putting youth on the different planning teams and planning committees and ministry committees isn't so much because they have all this wonderful experience and insight for a leadership committee. It's to develop relationships with your church leaders. If I've got a church leader that I would love for a youth to get to know, who is serving on my church council, I want to have a couple of youth who are rubbing elbows with that person in leadership and seeing how he or she leads in those meetings. I would say create a goal and let your pastor know and the nominations committee know that you want to start working toward having at least 1 youth serving on every committee in your congregation, every ministry committee in your congregation. You've got some youth who regularly go on mission trips. So why not put 1 of those youth, at least, or 2, on the mission committee to help plan the congregation's outreach and missions in the community or in the world. They don't have to necessarily participate in the adult mission trips, but their insight on those mission trips could be very valuable. And having them participate in the preparation for those mission trips would help to increase their interest in what the congregation is doing in mission, as well as their knowledge of that, so that when they are adults moving out of the youth ministry, now they are feeling comfortable stepping right into the role of missions in their own congregation. The other thing that a youth discovers when they serve on a committee like that is the power of their voice. I don't know how many times I've been in a meeting or an annual conference and a teenager has stepped up to speak, and people tend to pay much more attention when a youth speaks at those meetings than some of the adults who like to talk. And when a youth figures that out, they discover that they've got a little bit more influence and a little bit more of the ear of their congregation than they thought that they had. And we have a blessing in the United Methodist Church in that when a youth joins our congregation, they are full members of the church and have all of the privileges of all of the other members. Let's take advantage of that blessing and use them for that. And
I think, Sam, one of the things that along that line, I was the church council chair for too long, but helping the council, those that are older,
mm-hmm.
understand how to welcome and involve those young people too. Even though most of them are grandparents or parents themselves, for some reason, when they move themselves into church leadership roles, it's like they've completely lost this idea of how do they relate to young people for whatever reason, because I just saw it, right? And so we really worked a long time on helping the youth council representatives that were at the church council meeting, giving them a place to speak and be heard, so that they were further appreciated as more than just people that ate pizza and played games, you know?
Right. And sticking with that idea of it going both ways, I think a lot of times the hesitancy that our adults have over that you mentioned is because adults figure, and in most cases they're correct, I guess, that most teenagers don't want to do anything with the adults.
Right.
My mom, who you mentioned at the very beginning in the introduction, she knows children's ministry and she knows faith development in our young. But I remember when I first mentioned to her the importance of the whole congregation developing relationships with the young people in their congregation, she made the comment, "I could learn a lot from that," she said. And I said, "Well, tell me what you mean." She said, "Well, twice a week I sing in the choir, once on Thursdays for practice and once on Sundays. And in the choir loft, I sit next to a girl in high school." She said, "I don't even know her name, but I meet with her twice a week and sit right next to her." And I said, "Well, why don't you know her name?" And she said, "Because I don't talk to her because I figure she doesn't want to talk to an old lady in the choir loft."
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Well, of course she doesn't want to talk to an old lady. You don't even want to know her name."
Yeah. And that's what Nick shared. He said, it's like the leaders want to hold youth accountable, but fail to hold themselves accountable to hospitality, and not just to welcome them, but also if there's a dissonant voice, like if they's like, "Well, I don't agree with that,"
Yeah.
I've shared this before, but I remember one time as the church council chair, we had a group that was a Way of Pilgrimage study group. It was mostly older adults that had come and said that they just wanted to encourage our church to be a praying church before we made any decision. And it was great, right? It'd be an easy thing. Yes, we can get on board. Well, there were some people that were angry about it, that they felt that there was this assumption that they didn't already pray for things before we made decisions. And there were young people there from the youth ministry waiting to give their talk and also give input. And the look on their faces was like, why are we even fighting about this? And so those kind of things, like how we model, also decides on how well young people or people who have never been involved before want to be involved, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and what you've said reminds me so much of what Mark Ostreicher has commented on with faith development, and that is that our teenagers, adolescents, have certain traits and abilities and gifts, and adults are so willing to point to the negative things, but they don't always recognize some of the positive things that can really be things that can help our congregation and help us in our ministries. Youth are a lot more willing to try something that's never been tried before, and are willing to take a risk and step out in faith sometimes that adults are thinking, well, we need to really wait and hold off on this. And to have that pushing against the other side in a committee meeting can be really helpful in our churches. But to keep them out of those, whether intentionally or just by accident, does us no good. A couple more things on here. Practice learning involves the coaching of a mentor, parent, or teacher through intentional repetitions. This is historical and biblical. You'll find it in all through the Old Testament, where it talks about the importance of teaching our young people by over and over and helping them adhere to the story. The more a teenager hears and sees familiar people talk about and practice their faith, the more confident and comfortable it feels to participate with the community in faith. And that goes along with that worship. The more that they're sitting in worship and they feel comfortable sitting next to the congregation and the way they worship and how they pray, they see this family or this matriarch in the congregation step up and pray at the altar. The more they're familiar with that, the more comfortable they are in that situation as they get older. And then sharing of faith and stories, testimonies, giving your youth freedom to speak ideas, share their story, and ask questions out loud about faith and theology. Teens need to know they can share ideas and thoughts or questions and not be shot down. There's a book by Amanda Drury called Saying is Believing, and she talks a lot about that in that book. The importance of teenagers being able to speak out loud in their community of faith what it is they believe, even if what they believe isn't really according to our doctrine. They need to hear themselves speak so that they can start learning and recognizing what is right. So those are the keys of that successful, sustainable ministry. But I also had a few other comments here. Older disciples give insight and wisdom to the young show how the old can enter into the kingdom, and it's an investment into the future.
Hey, Sam. One of the things I wanted to ask, because we have about 5 minutes or so.
I want to give time for questions. So,
yeah. And so chapter 5 in your book, it talks about how do you assess your church and how do you, to be able to know where to make changes and move forward. Can you you prepare or share a little bit about that process?
Yeah. So chapter 5 is a survey, and I recommend giving that out to various people. The benefit of giving it out to your whole congregation as well as your whole staff would be that you'd have the feedback of all of these different groups. But it could start with just your staff and handing that out, or to your parents, handing that questionnaire out. What it does is it measures the perception that your congregation has in the siloed or not siloed ministry. Questions like, in the last 6 weeks, how many times did you see a youth participating in worship? They're going by memory. So you might know that there was a youth participating in some way of worship leadership for the last 6 weeks, and people might have answered that they don't remember ever seeing that. So that's a perception situation. They're still perceiving the youth as separate, even though you've thought you've done some work to keep them involved in the worship service. But you go through that chapter, you make copies of that, you send that out to everybody, you get the results back, and then you have a couple of meetings that explain the importance of integration and how they're perceived by the congregation, how the congregation is perceived as being siloed.
Do you know if is that survey still available that's mentioned there where you can download it, the bit.ly/one-body survey?
You know, I have not checked lately because that was through the youth cartel. So I don't know if that's still there or not. I should check.
I'll check it right now.
Yeah, there's an editable version of that survey, and you could download it. And I don't know why they would take that out. I mean, it's printed in the book, so I can't imagine they would just quit that. And
one thing I would say too, like, it downloaded it directly. Would say, you know, for sometimes it's the words that we use, and staff, for me, when I think of staff, and I think of, you know, some churches might not have staff, so we're talking about anybody, like your leadership, like church council people, have them take the survey. Your youth council, have your the people who are you know, you would say are making decisions, have them be involved in taking the survey and give input, because they're most likely to be there on a regular basis, I would say. Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the church council or the church leadership, because I think that this idea of developing these relationships and looking for ways for the youth to be involved in the whole congregation and their ministries is important to put out there to your congregation even before they start seeing the effects of it. For example, let's say you were in a church that has a separate youth building, separate from the rest of the church building. When you're giving your church council report about the youth ministry, you can point out that that while you love having a space and you love that the church wanted to support the youth ministry by providing this space, there are some issues with having this separate youth space. And that is that the only ones that usually go in that building are teenagers. And so they don't, and when the teenagers go there, they don't feel like they're missing out on anything else at the church. And so we're already dividing up our youth from the rest of the congregation. And that means that we've got to compensate in other ways. We've got to bring some congregation members into the youth space and have them start sharing their story. We've got to find ways to bring youth into these other ministries. So that way, whenever your church leaders go by and they see that building, they're not just seeing it as a wonderful youth space, they're also recognizing that it has its negative aspects as well. And we've got to work hard to overcome the negatives so that the positive can still be something helpful. Any questions that you all have before we have to close this up? I wanted to put this slide up here so that everybody could see it. These are a lot of things that happen in youth ministry that we often look at as goals for something that we like, but they actually have some negative aspects as well in building the silo. Nothing? Does anybody have any questions for Sam? Comments? Brooke, I would love for you to share what you guys, we had sort of a side conversation as you were talking, Sam, earlier about Sunday school and worship, about the fact that a lot of times Sunday schools and our attendance is abysmal. You know, it's everybody's trying to get people in Sunday school, and what I've seen lately where it's working better is when it's not, the purpose of Sunday school cannot solely be about education. And that's what we've ran it as. We've ran it as the school aspect more than the worship on Sunday aspect. But it sounds like Brooke is at Madison Street and Ashley have tried to do something different. So what share with us, Brooke?
Sure. So a couple of factors have really helped influence our youth and our children's time. We added a component called NextGen Live. And NextGen Live takes place in the youth lounge on Sunday mornings from about 9 to 9:20, 9:25, somewhere around in there. And it starts out, our youth is actually 5th through 12th grade. So they hang out as a whole group. We have refreshment time, we have hangout time, but then we have a stage in that area. So we have 2 hosts that Ashley will get together with and choose for the month. And those hosts are actually in charge of that sort of opening time, that whole group opening time. And they will do prayer requests, praise reports. They will do, sometimes they'll do a song. They've done that in the past. They'll do a game or an activity that ties into a Bible verse or a purposeful type of activity. And then they will do announcements. And the youth lead all of this. We have one that runs the sound for this. We have the host, they ask people to pray. We've had youth in the past who've been in charge of the games. So we've really tried to allow them to have ownership of it. And then after we finish that whole group time, then they go to their classes where it is more age-based, grade level, in-depth study. But the other thing that has really rescued our youth program has been the formation of an adult Sunday school class for their parents. And it has been a really successful class. We have a fantastic couple of facilitators who've been very intentional about reaching out to parents of youth who are in sort of the same stage of life and the same seasons. And it has really boosted that time. And what you see is, the name of the class is Kairos. What you see that is that if Kairos doesn't meet one Sunday, we don't have as many youth that Sunday. Or if Kairos is, having a great study, then our youth are affected in a great way. The same thing similarly is happening in children's ministry. We've just started a study in there that has boosted children's Sunday school time. And the same thing, that study was made intentionally for parents of those age children. And we purposefully reached out to people who had been attending service but had not been attending Sunday school. So we've seen some good success with those factors.
That's great. Cool. Thank you.
Yes.
Other questions or comments before we wrap up? Go ahead, Sam.
Well, I was just going to say, so obviously this isn't something you can just flip a switch and we switch over to integrating youth into the congregation. It's something that's got to be always held out before the congregation by the pastor and whoever's working with youth, reminding them, because unfortunately a congregation, when they see that we've got somebody taking over the youth program and we've got volunteers and we've got a space for the youth to meet and they have a budget, they figure they've done everything they need in youth ministry. Yeah. And that they have actually compartmentalized it and taken care of it. So we've always got to remind them. And I would say, start asking your congregation questions like, who are you praying for daily? Do you have a teenager you're praying for every single day by name? I've got a youth minister here in the conference that has little business cards printed and it has a blank on it for him to write the name of a teenager that they will start praying for. And he tells a little bit about that person and just says, I'd love it if you would pray for this person for the next 2 months by name or whatever it is. And then he asks when he runs up to these people, so who are you praying for? Remind me who you're praying for by name again. Or he'll stop and ask an adult Sunday school class, who are you all praying for? That's a great place to start.
And I've heard of churches that have, and maybe they talk about it in Sticky Faith, where you take a picture, you're taking a picture of each of the youth, right? And then on the back, you're putting a short bio. And I've even heard it the other way, that, every congregation member, there's a picture and a bio, and how can you share those photos of people with each other, so that it might be a child that's praying for an 80-year-old or an 80-year-old praying for a senior in high school or whatever. But there's some kind of conversational interaction that's going to happen. So
we've done that in a couple of my churches. We did it during the season of Lent. So it gives a beginning and an end. It's something that they're taking on. And we say, I encourage the congregation during the next 8 weeks, counting Easter, to be praying for a young person in our congregation. And then we had in the narthex a table with the 3x5 cards with a picture of the kid, name of their parents, birth date, and just some of the things that kid enjoys, so that they would have, know how to engage them in conversation.
All right. Well, Sam, I just want to say thanks. It's always good to have a conversation with you. And so, and thank you all for being on the call, on this video conference. And I would say, if you don't have Sam's book, you want to get it. And it's still available at the Youth Cartel, right? Is it? Where else?
And well, I was at Perkins last week in Dallas, and they said, somebody there said they found it on Amazon. So I was surprised because I thought the Youth Cartel had stopped providing it on Amazon. So it's possible it's there again.
Yeah. So it's really good. I like books that are not really big too, but it's full of stuff, full of good stuff to use. And it's very easy to read, and it's also very practical to apply. It's not a lot, it's stuff that you're going to be able to sit down with a team, with a group of people and work through that survey and instruments there. But it also talks about then what do you do in the follow-up? Like, what do you do, like bringing people together to talk about the results of the survey and how to create some strategy coming out of that. Thank you all. Next month on this webinar is Stephen Argue with Fuller Youth Institute, and he'll be talking about the two books that they've come out with recently. One, Growing Young, and then the other is Growing With. And so I invite you to be on those calls with us.